All right. So I can already see people are popping in. So I'm going to play the reel and we're going to get right into it. We're talking with Blair today all about collection agencies. Stay tuned. I'm David C. Barnett, and you're tuned in to Small Business and Deal Making, the podcast, YouTube channel, and blog where I talk about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium sized businesses while controlling risk. So, if you're looking to take control of your future through buying a business one day, or if you already own a business and you're looking to grow or exit, you've come to the right place. I talk about interesting things, I talk to interesting people, and I answer your questions every week right here. So, be sure to hit like and be sure to hit subscribe, and let's get to it. Are you thinking of growing your business or beginning a journey into entrepreneurship? Take a shortcut to success by buying an existing and profitable business the right way. Visit businessbuyeradvantage.com and learn more about my online training, group coaching, and consulting services designed to help you win. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us live today. I've got Blair DeMarco-Wettlaufer here from Kingston Credit and Data. Is that the name of the company?
Instant data and credit.
Kingston Data and Credit, who runs collection agencies in both Ontario, Canada, as well as in Florida. And it's great to have you join us because the audience is largely Canada and the U.S. And I know that this industry is pretty highly regulated with a lot of rules. And you've successfully navigated the rules in two different countries. First of all, though, I'd like you to give us some just tell us your story, Blair. Like, tell us your background. How did you get into this industry? What brought you to the place you're in today?
Well, that's a long story. I've been in the industry for 30 odd years. I ended up getting promoted at a company right out of university to be a credit manager. I worked with collection agencies assigning work to them. And when the company got amalgamated, I ended up knocking on the collection agency I was giving work to's door saying, hire me. And I had a background in English and psychology, leading towards, I was supposed to be an English teacher. That didn't happen. But my background and my experience as a credit manager all worked to fall into collections, because nobody grows up saying, I want to be a bill collector someday. And I worked for a series of collection agencies, big and small. And about 12, 13 years ago, I worked with Jason Kingston. That's where the Kingston Data and Credit came from,
Okay.
to open our own agency. And now we have 5 branches in Canada and 1 branch in the United States. And we represent 4,000 odd clients of varying sizes in consumer and commercial collections.
Tell me about the very first collection call you made. Who were you trying to collect for, and who did you call?
Well, way back when I did collections when I was at a credit manager for a newspaper, and they didn't have a credit manager, and they said, oh, well, I was just doing office accounting, and I came across $500,000 in receivables. And I said, who's taking care of this? And they said, nobody. And of course, I was a very excitable 20-something-year-old person. I said, well, can I go get the money? And they said, sure. So I remember calling. It was a business that had advertised in the newspaper. They owed $3,000. And I called them. Oh yeah, the check's right here on the desk. I'll come get it. At that point, I had like little round blue John Lennon glasses and a ponytail, I had a black trench coat, and I looked like somebody out of the Breakfast Club, and because it was the '80s. And I literally drove to everyone who said they had a check ready. Oh, it isn't signed yet. I'll wait. So I ended up collecting $300,000 in 6 months. And they talk
Wow.
now about the gamification of the workplace. But back then it wasn't a thing. But I knew I had done a good job. I had justified my position. Years and years of my salary collected in 6 months, and I was then able to work with my sales department. Please stop selling to the people who don't pay. To set up credit terms. Add interest. Remind people, and then set deadlines for, okay, this is out of my hands, now it goes to the collection agency. So, and when I went to collections, back in the '80s, people were standing on desks, shouting, banging phones in waste paper baskets. It was smoking at their desks. It was monstrous. Imagine something between The Sopranos and uh, I can't even remember that show that did Mad Men. Imagine it's a combination between those. And I had gone to school for psychology. I'm like, yelling at people doesn't work. So I ended up calling. I was put on a credit card, the Dolmy's department store credit card back in the 80s. And people are yelling, Mr. Jones, you owe me $10,824. At what point today can I expect you in my office? Ah, it was terrible. And I'd call and go, hi, is Frank there? Hi, Frank, your social insurance number is this, your date of birth is this. Files ended up on my desk and I've been asked to do the bad thing. So before I do the bad thing, what's your side of the story? And 9 out of 10 people paid me and then thanked me for paying me. And I remember the collection agency owner, he was a very intense guy. He's like, let me get this straight. You're not asking for the money. That's right. And people are paying you the money. That's right. So we should stop asking for the money. That's right. And he just walked away and left me alone. But you can't create a confrontational situation and hope to negotiate. And most people are stressed over finances. So I took a very unique approach to collections. And if you say, pay me $10,000, I'm not going to pay you $10,000. Oh yeah, I'm going to put this on your credit bureau and sue you. Well, when you get into the, oh yeah, now your kid's in a schoolyard, throwing rocks at each other. Um,
Right.
if you start with, I have your credit bureau in front of me. I know your social insurance number. I know your date of birth. I can see you're making all your payments on this. Oh, I see you're a little bit behind on your car. Your car's worth $40,000. Mary Sue in your payroll department says you make $18 an hour. So do you want to negotiate with me? You've established a position of authority and power without raising your voice. And most
Hmm.
people just want help. And if you say, here's the way to get out of trouble, or you give them an A, B choice, not a yes, no choice, you can pay me, or this will go to your credit bureau. It's entirely up to you. You're respecting people's agency to make their own decisions. And most people want to work with you if you work with them. There are some people, they're just angry and stressed, and the world owes them and you can't collect from them. But there's no point in punishing decent people for a handful of people that are just going to be malicious, if you call.
All right. So thank you very much because you've given us a quick snapshot of like the craziness you've seen, how you approach it a little bit differently. You also talked here about two very different kinds of people that a business might try to collect from. You're
Right.
talking about B2B customers where the customers themselves are other businesses. And then the other scenario would be that individual that earns $18 an hour that you made reference to. So what would be sort of the biggest differences between those two different categories or camps of clients that we might have eventually have trouble collecting from?
Behavior and scale. So the first thing is behavior. If you call Bob Jones personally owes the money. You can speak to Bob Jones, and Bob Jones feels obligated. If you call a business that owes money, and it could be Al's Towing all the way up to Microsoft, finding a person that is willing to take responsibility for a decision is a challenge because accounts payable clerks are a screening mechanism. A reception desk is a screening mechanism. And in this day and age, reaching a human being through a telephone can sometimes be a challenge. So you often want to go right to once a file gets to collections, you want to go right to the owner, even if you're calling them on their cell phone on the golf course and saying, I'm about to affect your company's credit rating. Are you sure you want me to do that? And suddenly the decision maker deals with it. Now, from a strategy standpoint, commercial collections doesn't have the scale of consumer collections. So if you have a hydro company, say you had Toronto Hydro as a client, they're going to send you 1,000 to 2,000 customers every month that are past due, 90 days or more. If
Hmm.
you're working with a commercial collection company like John Deere, they're probably only going to send you 10 accounts a month, and they're going to
Right.
be much higher balances. And a collection agency, it's a lot swingier. If you're working $10,000, $20,000 accounts or $1,500 accounts, the 1,000 accounts, it's easier to get a law of averages and predict what your performance is going to be. The 10 accounts, it can be more challenging.
Okay. And you mentioned something earlier too when you were talking about the newspaper, and you mentioned to the salespeople, stop selling to people who don't pay their bills. Let's get a credit policy in place here. Let's talk about this because I want to get the conversation into, when a small business owner would employ a collection agency to help them out. But I think that we could start that conversation much earlier because, and you mentioned, credit terms, understanding, what the business is exposing themselves to. I think a lot of people, especially in the world of small business, they get excited about a sale. They don't think
Sure.
about that stuff.
Well,
They
even big companies don't. The first step is credit adjudication. When a client comes on, I cannot tell you the national companies that have sent me a file saying, we want you to collect this $10,000 that's 6 months past due. Who owes it? Al's Towing. Okay, is Al's Towing a corporation or proprietorship? We don't know. Okay, who's in charge at Al's Towing? Al. Al who? We didn't ask. So the most important thing that any company can do when you land a client is have an onboarding process where you gather all that information. Is it a corporation or is it a proprietorship? Who's personally responsible? If you've got the leverage and it's a corporation, get a personal guarantee or a letter of engagement. Get them to sign terms. So if things go sideways, you've got in writing what they've agreed to. That's supported if you have to take a small claims court or general court action, or you have to report it to the bureau. You've got, well, they signed here. And if once you bring on a client, it's important to keep your information current. We'll get an account and it'll say Al's Towing was a great client for 4 years. They've gone sideways. Here's all their information. And we call, and Al's Towing's phone number's been out of service for a year. The original creditor hasn't seen the warning signs. So,
mm,
it's important to touch base with your clients, even if they're in good standing, every 6 months or a year, and just, hey, we're having the sale. Hey, just touching in, has any of your contact information changed? Hey, and if, say, an email bounces or that person isn't there, you can get that information in front of you before it goes sideways. And also you'll keep your customers happy. And you want to have a process when an account does go past due that you're not making exceptions. Well, Bob Smithers is such a nice guy. I'm just going to let it go a little longer. And suddenly it's 2 years old. And now it's outside the statute of limitations and you can't sue it. You should have a process. At day 30, we send out a reminder notice. At
yeah.
day 60, we make a phone call. We call once every 2 weeks. Once it gets to day 120, once it gets to day 90, we stop selling them. Once we get to day 120, we'll send it to a collection agency. Like, if you have these hard steps in place, you'll protect your company. But
It,
obviously, you want customers to pay you and you want to retain customers. So it's a fine balancing act.
it's interesting because I've often said to clients that I'm working with, business owners that I'm working with, they'll get excited because some company that they perceive as a big, company in their industry or their target market will call them up suddenly and they'll say, "Well, I've never had a chance to do business with these people." And I'll say, "Wait, so did you pursue them or did they just call you out of the blue one day?" And because to me, a company calling you up out of the blue, wanting to do business with you, is almost can be a red flag. Because I
That's how
would
the
want to
world
know
works.
who were they doing business with and why aren't they doing business with them anymore? Versus me, have landing a customer that I worked hard to get.
Customers calling in now is far more prevalent. Inbound sales is far more prevalent than outbound sales. There's a fellow named Scott Stratton. He put out a book called Unmarketing, brilliant book, and he has a website called unmarketing.com.
Hmm.
And he talks about the way to successfully pull clients. And gone are the days of the door-to-door salesman and cold calls, because we live in a different environment. And prospective sales contacts can go onto Google and know more about your company than your sales rep by the time they call you. So that does happen a lot, but it could be a red flag because they've run up a huge amount of credit with company A, and then they change to company B and run up a huge amount of credit and they haven't paid and they go to company C. Yes, it can be a red flag. So it is useful if you're Bob the dentist, you don't want to be, you're going to take what you get. If you're a mid to large company with $10 million in sales, you want to invest in Dun and Bradstreet to pull a commercial credit report, or Ansonia.com, which is an adjunct of Equifax. So you can pull one-by-one credit bureaus, and they cost you $20-$30 to pull. But
Yeah.
that $20-$30 is insurance for not having to collect $100,000 a year later.
In one of my past jobs when I was younger, I was actually a purchasing agent in a rather large organization. And it was interesting to me because it was one of the first big companies I ever worked in. And the big company, of course, is afraid of fraud or paying people
Right.
before work is done and things like that. And so the company had a process where, I had to issue a PO. The receiver at our warehouse had to file paperwork saying they had received certain goods. This had to be matched in the payables department. And only when all these things matched together would they then even consider paying an invoice that had been received. And I found it interesting that I was having conversations with people who hadn't been paid, and they didn't understand the process that we had. And so this again is one of the things I often mention to people is when the first time you sell, especially to a bigger entity, understand what they're ask the question, say, what has to happen over at your place before payment gets issued? Because you could be inadvertently sitting on something that they needed to order in order to do their bureaucratic process.
Yes, yes. And ideally have at least 2 points of contact, because you might have an accounts payable clerk and then someone higher upstream if you need to escalate an issue.
Yeah. So so at what point you alluded to this a little bit earlier, kind of briefly. When should a small business start to look for a collection agency to help them go after a delinquent account? How old does it need to be before it makes sense to get some help?
Um, it depends on the company and the industry. I would typically say 120 to 180 days, depending on what your normal performance of DSO or day sales outstanding are. Some clients send us files at 90 days or even 60 days. But again, it depends on the industry. When you send a file to collections, even if you get a good collection agency that are not knuckle dragging goons, there's a chance you'll never get that client back. So you want to look at your AR, and you want to say, okay, anything over 90 days, I'm not getting paid. I need this cash flow. I'm not expecting, if you were a industry that sold to people on a one-time basis, you could be more aggressive. If you're dealing with government contracts and they are just naturally slow, you might want to send it later. But ultimately, you want to set one rule for your company. If it's 120 days, it's 120 days for everybody. If it's
Have you
100,
ever had to collect from a government?
oh yes, yes, I've had to collect from the Department of National Defense.
Okay, awesome. I'm just curious because I would assume that if they order something and all the paperwork was there, they would eventually pay. I mean, that's the reputation that governments
Would
have is that
think.
they eventually pay, right?
At one point I had to collect for I think it was at that point Office Depot. This is years and years ago, and it was a commercial credit card for supplies. And a credit union owed money. So I called the credit union and said, "You owe this much." And they said, "Well, it's all interest, and we have a policy of not paying interest." Are you a credit union? Yes. Do you charge interest when you borrow money? Yes. But you don't want to pay interest when you borrow money. Can I have a loan from you? Um, you know, so you run up into these weird circumstances. Or imagine when Target pulled out of Canada. There were credit managers panicking and trying to turn trucks around because once the inventory was delivered, they couldn't get it back.
Hmm.
There are all
Okay.
sorts of crazy things that happen. No day, every day is an adventure. No 2 days are the same.
When someone makes the decision that they're going to hire a collection agency, what kinds of things are you looking for to be able to do your job?
Let's focus on Canada for the first part. So
Okay.
in Canada, you have to be licensed in every province or territory that you want to collect from. So if you're Bob the dentist,
This is a very highly regulated business.
yes, highly regulated. So if you're Bob the dentist or Mississauga Hydro, you only need an agency that's licensed in Ontario. If you're a national business, you need to have someone who's licensed across the country. If you're collecting on commercial accounts, there's some exceptions. You don't have to have a licensed agency, but you really want a licensed agency. You don't want Frank working out of the back of his house. You want a reputable company. You want to look at their Google reviews. How have they treated companies or individuals, and how have they and they're going to get 1-star reviews no matter what. Even we have 1-star reviews, and we try to take care of people, and we've got a 4.3-star rating. But how do they treat the people who give them a 1-star review? Oh, they're terrible, they eat babies. Well, how do they deal with aggression and conflict? You want to have ask for copies of their licenses, and you want to ask questions about their process. There are collection agencies that will take your files, and they could have 400 agents, and you give them 5 files, and they throw them on a predictive dialer, and they just get churned in the wash, and there's no focus on your accounts. Or they could go to a dedicated staff member and get worked. So depending, I have a blog, receivableaccounts.com, and I actually talk about how to hire a collection agency, and I have a checklist how to audit them. And like there are questions in there, like if you're going to be assigning significant accounts, you have every right as a client to say, I'd like to speak to the collector that's going to be working my accounts. Or can you show me a sample inventory report? Or what's your historical liquidation on similar companies in my industry? And obviously ask and don't just call one agency, call several, or do some Google research on a company. There are you can ask for certifications like Better Business Bureau certified. Generally, agencies aren't. You can ask if they belong to trade associations. That usually indicates they're a reputable agency. So in Canada, there's the Receivables Management Association of Canada and the Canadian Society of Collection Agencies.
And okay, so you choose one, and you're confident that they're going to be giving your files the attention they deserve. What are they going to need to be successful?
So what they need to do, the more information they provide the agency, the better. So, proprietor or commercial account, determine the legal entity, contact names, last known address, date of delinquency, email addresses. If it's consumer debt, date of birth, social insurance number, driver's license number. If you get into like subprime lending, references, but really we've moved away from that as an industry. Like that it's not as we don't call neighbors and references like we used to in the 80s, or we shouldn't at least. So the more information you give if you're charging interest, what the interest rate is, so the agency can use that as leverage. Well, Bob, your
So
balance today is X.
so you want to see some kind of like contract or engagement agreement, some kind of written thing that describes who the two parties are that are doing business, what's being done, how much it
Or an
is.
invoice, or a
Okay.
statement. And we don't, so if you're Frank the landlord and you had a bad tenant, yes, I want to see the landlord tenant tribunal order. If you're Purolator, I don't want you to send me every invoice. Send me a spreadsheet, and if a consumer disputes a debt, provide me the invoice. But under the different provincial legislations, we have to have reasonable belief the debt is valid. We get all sorts of calls. I loaned my brother $5,000. Can you get involved? No. But if there's a paper trail showing you sold this company 5,000 widgets, here's the invoice, here's the PO, good enough.
Okay. Okay. And is there much difference there with in the states? There's a different regulatory wise? Okay.
So the states is so in Canada, you've got provincial and territorial legislation, and they're close to each other. There's small regional differences. Quebec, to collect in Quebec, you have to have an in-province office. To collect in Ontario, you have to have an in-province office. To collect in BC, you have to write an exam and have an in-province trust account. So there are rules. In the states, it is the Wild West. State A could be wildly different than state B. There's federal legislation. Some states have no legislation. Some states have legislation. Some cities have legislation. Like in New York City, if you collect a post-dated check, you have to call them between 2 and 10 days before you cash the check to let them know you're cashing the check. Like there are very specific rules. In some states, if it's consumer debt, you're allowed to speak to the spouse because it's a community property state. In others, you can't. In some states, you have to say the mini Miranda before you disclose any details. In other states, you don't. It's all over the place.
So how do you keep like how would one of your employees be on top of this? You must have just like some kind of database that summarizes the rules for every call that someone's going to make.
Mhm. So we built our own contact management system, and when they pull up a file in Ohio, it has a little side panel. Here are the rules for Ohio, and
Wow.
in the states as well. So in Canada, the statute of limitations is pretty unified. It's either 2 years or 7 years, depending what province. Most are moving towards 2 years for legal action. In the states, a written contract in Ohio might be 7 years. An oral contract might be 6 years. A recurring service agreement might be 5 years. So the statutes of limitations are all over the place in the states as well.
So if you're a company doing business nationally in the U.S. and you want to work with a collection agent on delinquent accounts, you you could add to your checklist of investigating their technological capacity to manage
Yes.
the regulatory framework.
And there are also so the CFPB is the governing body for the Federal Fair Debt and Collection Practices Act. They have a website, and the CFPB actually, you can search and say, I want to look at X agency, and how many complaints does this agency have, or have they responded to them? CFPB stands for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they can be found at www.consumerfinance.gov.
Okay. And so, okay, so one of the questions that I had, and we were chatting about this a little bit before we went live, was just where does someone learn about this industry if they have an interest in this industry? And I'm guessing you really need to work in this industry to really learn it. It's not something you're going to go and read a book and then decide to open your own collection agency from scratch.
Not usually, because the rules are so finicky and they change constantly. There are a couple industry organizations like the Receivable Management Association of Canada. They send out
Mhm.
bulletins all the time. The commercial, the criminal interest rate has been reduced, or the province of New Brunswick has changed their legislation. So there are organizations, and there are industry specific organizations like the EUCI is Hydro. And hydro organizations get together and they talk about best practices, and they involve credit and collections. The Credit Institute of Canada has a knowledge base for commercial collections. There are industry groups, but most people, when they go to open a collection agency, they've worked in one and either thought, this is amazing, or I'm not doing it the way they ever did it. I'm going to do it differently.
It would seem though that scale is a real advantage. Like you talked about creating
Yes.
your own customer contact system. It would seem that if you didn't have that kind of technological ability, or it, well, let me ask you this: in your organization today, how many people are making collections calls versus sort of administrative overhead type people that make the whole machine work?
So we've got about 50 people that make collection calls.
Yeah.
And you got to keep in mind, I started in the 80s, but I worked with databases back when there were, MS DOS was a thing. So there are a lot of agencies that rely on predictive dialers. I've built a predictive dialer. I know what they can do. They're
This
terrible,
is the
terrible
auto
machines.
dialer that we often
Yes.
get phone calls from, and then we answer it, and there's nobody there because it didn't connect the other side. Is that what?
Well, the reason it doesn't answer is because they've built it wrong. Because what happens is agents show up to work at a collection agency, they jack into the matrix, and it makes four simultaneous calls for every collector. And what happens is if it gets no answer, it hangs up and it notes the file. If it gets an answering machine, it might leave a canned message. If a person says hello, it detects a live human being and routes it to a collector. That dead air is there's no available collectors to route it to. They're running it too hot.
Okay. Okay. So there's the technology, but there's also the tuning of it. We can call it.
Predictive dialers worked back when people had phones bolted to the wall, in the 90s, because everyone in the house is yelling, would someone get that? If you get a predictive dialer call, well, if you get any call and it's a toll-free number and it comes up on your cell phone, because 80% of people under the age of 50 don't have a landline,
Yeah.
if you don't recognize it, you're going to swipe right and turn your phone over.
Right.
You're not going to answer it. So you have to use modern collection techniques with email and SMS now. So I don't use a predictive dialer, but I do use SMS and email, either on an individual basis with my staff, or we can pull up 1,000 files and send them all a text simultaneously. And now the way the modern consumer works, if you get a little blinky red light on your phone, you actually get an endorphin rush when you answer a text. So you're actually more likely to answer a text than a phone call. And so they actually did a whole study on it, and the average person 10 years ago checked their phone every 13 minutes. And that's the average. Imagine what above average is.
Yeah, well, I know people that check it a lot more than that.
Right.
Um, what now? There are, but how many collection agencies do you think there are? Like, do you have any idea how big the industry is?
In Ontario, pre-pandemic, there were just under 400 licensed agencies.
Yeah.
Post-pandemic, there were 190. Um,
Wow. So
yeah,
half of them didn't survive.
the pandemic was not good. A lot of agencies were small shops that couldn't survive the pandemic and just closed their doors. Other agencies amalgamated, or were purchased by other agencies, or they just they were U.S. based agencies that had branches in Canada that just decided to circle the wagons and pull everything back to the U.S. There were a number
Hmm.
of reasons, but I would say and those are just licensed in Ontario. When we became nationally licensed and we did our last province, which was Nova Scotia, we went to write an exam. It was a 3-hour exam. It was terrible. I was told at the time there were only 23 national agencies in Canada that were truly national, that existed in Quebec and the Maritimes and what have you. And I found that really hard to believe. So I contacted my contacts at TransUnion, the credit bureau, and said, how many national? There are only 23 national agencies. So there's probably 400 regional agencies, of which 23 are national, maybe 25, not a lot.
And the licensing is public information somewhere, right? So if someone was interested in learning who are these collection agencies, they could find out, could they not?
Some of them have search pages. Like Ontario and BC, you can type in a company name and it'll say, yes, this agency is licensed. Here's their license number. Here's their contact information.
Okay.
Absolutely. Some provinces like Manitoba aren't as online, but every province has a website of here's how you get licensed. And some
And do you know
provinces,
do
hmm,
you know how big the industry would be in the US?
huge. There are probably, I would say, 6,000 or more agencies in the U.S. But
Okay.
some are commercial, and they don't have to be licensed in the states to do commercial collections, except in 3 states.
Okay.
Some are consumer and commercial. Some are just consumer, and they could range anywhere from 2 agents all the way up to 1,000 agents.
What if somebody wanted to get into this industry, based on what we're talking about here and the complexity, then you can really see where perhaps buying an existing business might make more sense than trying to start one from scratch. What tips would you have for someone who is open to looking at buying a collection agency? Because they do come up for sale. I mean,
All the time,
people
all
see
the
them,
time.
right?
I subscribe to a mergers and acquisitions email, and I see agency for sale, agency for sale, agency for sale. What people need to know is, collection agencies is a very thin margin market.
Hmm.
Your average agency probably only has a 5 to 10% profit margin. A good agency might have a 15 to 20% profit margin. So you shop carefully. It's not all about EBITDA, because collection agencies get inventory, they work it on contingency, and that's a level of risk, and then they generate revenue out of the assigned files. So the value of their assigned files, and how recent are they, like how many files have been assigned in the last 6 months, what's their dollar value, how many accounts is it, what are their historical liquidations, so you can project what their revenue will be. And of course, look at their service agreements, because it's entirely possible. It's not as much as it used to be, but we're very much a cult of personality. You could buy agency XYZ, and they have salesman Bob, who's amazing. You come in, you buy it, salesman Bob leaves and takes half the clients with you, and they're not obligated to stay. And now, why did you buy this agency? So you
Right.
you want to be cautious when you buy an agency, that you're buying something of value. It's not a warehouse of widgets. It's not a factory. It's a service industry. So, and you're only as good as the people you retain. So
So let's talk about your business model a little bit because I find this terrifying, quite frankly. So you've got employees, and obviously you
Yes.
have some kind of wage or salary that you're paying your employees. They're making calls, and correct me if I'm wrong. Your income is a percentage of the funds you collect.
Correct.
Okay. So tell me about that because it would seem to me that you could end up on the wrong side of overhead with, a lot of wages to pay, but not enough money coming through the front door.
Potentially, yes. There is a level of risk. Now, there are some agencies that buy debt and then they own it outright, but that's now two levels of risk because they actually pay for the inventory and they pay 1 to 10 cents on the dollar. And now they
Hmm.
have the inventory and then they have the risk of calling and actually collecting. So, yes, there are levels of risk. But that being said, people who've worked in this industry can say, okay, that's a hydro company. They're going to liquidate 30% of the accounts over a period of 12 months. They're going to assign accounts of an average balance of $500. This agent, they ask the hydro company, how many files are you going to assign? Okay, 150 accounts a month. Okay, we'll give half a body to that. Here's our overhead for half a body. And really, agencies, the bulk of our overhead are the people. It's
Hmm.
not the technology, it's not the rent, it's not the licenses. 80-90% of our overhead is people. And you can do the math and say this client should generate this much revenue per month with this much manpower. So you can forecast it out. And agencies watch it on a daily basis. And if something starts going sideways, okay, did we get the right accounts? Did the client give us good information? Is the collector doing what they normally do? And you can map it out.
Okay. So so yeah, people do make money in this business, but like you said, a lot of people have folded up. So it's got the same risk profile as any kind of a business out there. You really have to understand the industry and know what you're getting into.
Absolutely, absolutely. The pandemic was very difficult for companies because a lot of creditors said, "Oh my God, it's a pandemic. Stop calling our files." And if you were an agency that dealt with a bank and they represented 80% of your revenue stream and the bank said, "Stop calling," what are you going to do? 80% of your revenue just died overnight.
Right.
Look for, if you're going to buy an agency, look for one with a diversified client base, that, they don't have all their eggs in one basket. Make sure that their staff have good tenure, that they have a good company culture. A lot of agencies are very rotating door. You didn't collect your revenue this month, you're out. So, they don't have a lot of tenure with their team. Or they create an environment of haves and have nots. They have a small cadre of collectors that have been there 5-10 years that do great, and then they have a constant stream of what they call junior collectors that are just constantly coming and going. So you want to ask probing questions if you're going to look at acquiring an agency.
Okay. So now let's look at it from the other side of the table. If I am a small business and I'm in some kind of dispute with a supplier and they're, saying you got to pay this, and let's say I don't believe I owe the money, like what are some strategies that somebody could do? What should someone be doing if they're trying to not pay something they don't think they owe?
So for a B2B, that can be challenging. So if I was collecting a B2B account, I can contact someone and they can say, I dispute the debt. Here's my paper trail of why I've disputed this since the beginning. Stop collections. I can stop collections if I deem the dispute worthwhile. But let's say I'm a terrible collection agency. I say, no, you're going to pay this or I'm going to ruin your company's credit rating. There's nothing stopping me from reporting it to the Bureau. Now, the Equifax has a dispute process. So you can, if you've built a paper trail, file a dispute saying, no, I dispute this debt. Here's why. And the credit bureau may arbitrate and say, that's legitimate. Okay, we believe your dispute. We'll take the rating off. Or they could say, nope, this looks legit. I'm sorry, I'm going to side with the agency. And then there's not a lot you can do. I mean, you could start a general court action to prove the debt unjust, but now you're paying $6,000 to a lawyer to have it stricken from the credit bureau. You can't do it through small claims court. And you obviously run the risk if it's a large debt that the agency or a lawyer representing the creditor or the creditor themselves could undertake a court action, a civil court action to secure the balance they feel is owed. So, in short, if you're a business trying to protect yourself, paper trail, paper trail, paper trail.
Okay. And so you brought up court. So let's talk about that
Sure.
because sometimes people do end up in court when it comes to debts, and there are judgments issued by judges, saying, yeah,
Right.
this money's owed or whatever. And once you have the judgment, then you've got a whole other slew of collection opportunities available to you, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit
Potentially.
about that?
So, in most provinces, the statute of limitations for taking a court action is 2 years. And, some different provinces have rules for who can represent them in small claims court or general court. In Ontario, where most of the debts are, the small claims court limit is $35,000. You must use a licensed person or entity with the Law Society of Ontario. And the cost of a small claims court action $800 to $1,000 if everything goes right. So you're not going to sue someone for $200, but
Right.
$10,000, sure you will. And there's a whole process of you have them served. They have 20 days to file a defense. If they don't file a defense, you get a default judgment. And yes, you have options, but sometimes a default judgment is just a very expensive piece of paper, unless you know their wages to garnish or a bank account to seize or a lien to place against a property or a writ against a property. You can pull them in for a judgment debtor exam. You can, demand probing questions, but most judgments go unrealized. Like, if you are a landlord and you evict somebody, the landlord tenant tribunal issues an order to evict them. It is a judgment, but executing on that judgment can be a challenge.
Yeah, from back in my landlord days, I've actually got two judgments from small claims here in New Brunswick, so a different set of rules from what
Sure.
Ontario would have. But I've got two judgments against people, and yeah, they're like, well, then what do you do, right? Like
Right.
you
We have
you have
clients all
to,
the time call us going, sue this guy. And we're like, I don't recommend it. You could be throwing good money after bad. But we do, the credit bureau is a very powerful tool now. We make attempts to contact people, and we can't contact 30% of the accounts we have. A lot of people ignore us. And we then press the big angry red button and put it on their credit bureau. And then we get a call 3 years later. Oh my God, I can't get a car. No, because why didn't you tell me? We tried. We sent a letter. We sent an
yeah,
email. We made these 8 calls. You should have called us back.
right. And so any tips? Because when I talk about when I talk to various people about sales and things like this, some people will actually say that if a certain percentage of the receivables don't go bad, it means they aren't doing a good enough job trying to push new revenue. So what's your theory on that, Blair? Like should we be making sales and trying to extend credit to a point where we can actually realize that we're hitting a point where we're maybe selling to people we shouldn't? Is there a
That
winning
sounds like
formula
somebody in a
there?
sales department trying to push things.
Sure. Yeah.
So credit managers end up in this weird no man's land. First of all, they often get pulled from finance or customer service or sales, and they get thrown, you're the credit manager now, good luck. And they're the last of the general managers. And they have to keep the peace between sales and operations and management. And often there's the eternal struggle between sales and collect and credit. I want to sell more. No, you can't sell more, or you have to sell responsibly. Obviously, you want to look at your bad debt write-off. If your bad debt write-off is 2%, 4%, count yourself lucky, depending on your industry group. If your bad debt write-off is 20%, you're doing something terribly, terribly wrong, and
Yeah.
you're selling too much. If your bad debt write-off is 0, maybe you could do more sales, or maybe you have a robust process and a trust, a well-curated client base and nothing's going wrong. Really internally, you want to look at your profit margin and how much of that bad debt write-off digs into that. And you want to have a realistic expectation. If you are a hydro company, and there are different industry averages, but if you're a hydro company and you send files to collections and you have a 4% bad debt 4% bad debt write-off rate, the agency is going to recover, a good agency is going to recover 30% over time. So you're offsetting around 1% of that 4%. If you're a payday loan company, you might have a bad debt write-off rate of 20%, maybe 30%, because you've got a pulse here, have $500.
Yeah.
And the agency's only going to be able to get you back 10% or 15% because collecting from people who owe payday loans, well, they borrow from this payday loan company and that payday loan. So it depends on the industry. I wouldn't say a 0% bad debt write-off rate is bad. If you're happy with your business and you're generating a reasonable profit margin and you see a growth in sales or a growth in revenue, don't rock the boat. But if you're struggling to get to that next level, yeah, maybe.
Sometimes when people are looking at a business they want to acquire, they'll see a business that, and this happens a lot with these long-term profitable businesses, where there will be this accumulation of money inside the business. So, they don't use a line of credit because they have lots of money from their prior years of profitability. And so they'll see a business has a lot of receivables, for example. But from the buyer's point of view, it means that there's a lot of operating capital required to make this business go. And so people will sometimes come up with this idea that, hey, I'm going to buy this business and change the normal terms of trade with the clientele. We're going to go from giving everyone 45 or 60 days to requiring a deposit when they make an order, or charging people on their credit cards, stuff like that. Any experiences you can share about companies trying to change the terms of trade with customers who may be used to doing business in a certain way?
So obviously, we're the last stage in the credit cycle. We see everything that's gone wrong and we have the benefit of hindsight. So a company that's changed their credit terms and it's gone well, we don't see. But I've seen companies change their credit terms and suddenly, we went 100 files a month, 100 files a month, 800 files a month. Whoa, what
Wow.
happened? And then we
Okay.
call all the customers and they're all angry. Obviously, if you're going to change credit terms, do it gradually, give your customers warning, get your customers feedback. If it's going to cost you your customer base, don't do it. Don't cut off your nose. I have this great idea. Don't let the armchair generals ruin things for the frontline people.
Hmm.
Because we see things when they've gone wrong for all sorts of businesses of all sorts of sizes.
What are some of the most common mistakes you've seen with collections and credit when it comes to customers?
Not having a handle on their customers, not keeping a good internal track record of
Mhm.
communications, lacking a contact management system, transfer of knowledge. When one credit manager leaves and someone steps in, there's no training, and the processes start all over. So having a good documented process that this is how we handle credit. Here's how we handle adjudication, onboarding. Here are the different steps. And assigning a reasonable amount of manpower. I know one internet company, they would send files to a collection agency at 90 days. We bid on their paper. We never did business with them, but we asked them, so what do you do internally? They sent one letter and made one phone call in 90 days. So, they
Yeah.
were, slash and burn farming, but only with customers because they were never going to get these customers back once they went to collection 90 days later. And they didn't create a sense of urgency with their customers. So, be careful. Processes can, even the smallest change can improve a process or sink a process, and
Yeah.
change your cash flow, which is your company's lifeblood.
Blair, this has been fantastic. If people are, if there's someone out there who has a bunch of delinquent accounts that they want to have collected, like, how can they reach you?
They can go to my company website, which is kingstondc.com. Or if they're looking for advice and best practices on how to clean up their credit department or audit a collection agency if they're shopping for one, because they don't have to use me. They could go find someone else, someone local to them or what have you, but they should ask the right questions. I have a blog, receivableaccounts.com, that I have a whole slew of articles, back when I had a little more time than I have now.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming in and talking with us today. It's been a great conversation, and thanks to everyone who tuned in live. And we've had a kind of comments, people thanking me for the content and everything that comes up here. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, stay tuned, everyone. If you're not, make sure you're on my email list, davidcbarnettlist.com, so you'll get a notification of all these live streams and guests as they come about. And Blair, I want to say thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
So, how can you learn more about buying, selling, financing, and managing small and medium sized businesses? Easy. Go over to my blog site, davidcbarnett.com, where you can learn more about me and how I work with my clients. You can learn more about my books and courses that I've prepared for you. You can find out how to subscribe to my email list, the YouTube playlists, and more. There's literally hundreds of hours of content there, all for free, and I'd love for you to be my guest. Special thanks go to Mark Willis at Lake Growth Financial, today's video sponsor. Mark helps people better manage their personal and business finances through the Bank on Yourself insurance strategy. This is something I've done personally and I've seen others use it successfully for years. Go to newbankingsolution.com to find all the interviews I've done with Mark and learn more about the advantages of these programs. While there, sign up for a free consultation to learn what this solution might look like for you.